Let's talk about functional morphology, which is basically just how does the shape of the organism contribute to its lifestyle. And remember, the way that evolution works is not that you need to do something, so you evolve an extra body part to do that. The way it works is that a mutation happens, you end up with a situation, and life hands you lemons and you make lemonade. So it's like, with this change, what can I do differently? What possibilities does that open up? So just make sure you got it the right way around. All right. So look at these things. Murexes, these are called a tiger something or other. A tiger whelk, maybe. I don't know. But these are from a group of gastropods, stromboid gastropods, and they have these little structures that come out from the shell. And you can see them over here on this beautiful little murex. Yeah, just gorgeous looking, like a little skeleton. And so the question is, all right, these structures exist. They've been built by the animal. So the animal has secreted these structures using its mantle. Yeah, we're not asking how do they build structures. That's like biomineralization and developmental patterning, really. We're asking, all right, once these exist, what are they for? Yeah. And so, first of all, these are some tests you can sort of run through and try to see if you can figure out, what potential advantage there might be to having body parts like these or parts of the shell like this. Because the shell is something that is secreted. The shell is not necessarily innate to the organism. There are some kinds of shells that will change depending on the conditions. Actually, a lot of shells will change a little bit, but there are some kinds, like on oyster shells, where they will completely wrap themselves around something in order to stay attached. And you'll end up with really different looking shells on the outside, just like if you look at the shape, but on the inside, it's got all the same parts in all the same places. And makes a lot of sense. So, first of all, consider, all right, knowing nothing about these creatures, if they were acting on a solid, so if they were like on or in the sediment, let's consider that. Let's also consider, what if they're acting in a fluid? So what if these are swimmers that are going to stay up, they're going to be pelagic, have some sort of swimming lifestyle. And then within that, within the solid category, let's say, all right, what if they acted in a dynamic substrate? So, like the sand right near the beach, where you're constantly getting moved around, or versus a static environment, maybe a deeper water environment where there wouldn't be much movement, but where the ground may be really soft, and it may help to be able to avoid sinking in to the ground, for example. Looking at that. And so these creatures, if you would see one, or if you would find a fossil that looked like this, they appear to be all on the ground, and they don't really make any sense in terms of acting in a fluid, because look at the shape. In order to just think of them as like a little canoe, if you're symmetrical, then you have control of direction. You can turn right, you can turn left, depending on, if you're like making a water jet, for example, like a lot of mollusks do, then you're able to turn. But if you have a shape that has a particular tilt to it, that has one side bigger than the other, then you are not going to be able to swim straight, or you're going to have to compensate for that. And so having a body plan like this would be, or a shell plan like this would be, very detrimental to a pelagic lifestyle. So just from looking at these and the way that they are not in any way symmetrical at all, yeah. And there are gastropods that are fine, that overcome this, but not these guys. Yeah. So you can say, there's no way that these things would be well adapted to working in a fluid. So you could conclude that they probably live on a substrate. Yeah, on or in. So, all right, great. And it could be dynamic, or it could be static. Fine. Maybe it works on both. So let's see. If we are on a solid state and it is dynamic, so if it's changing all the time, then you want to ask yourself, well, does this shape, would this maybe not prevent, but eliminate or limit, let's say limit, overturning. And like, just like if you're in something that's starting to tilt, if you make yourself really wide and hold on, then basically you'll stay upright. And so the wider it can be without expending as much energy to make the shell, the less likely it is to be able to be flipped over. Like imagine trying to flip this thing over. You got to flip it all the way up so it's standing on those little, shell, look like little claws almost, and then it would have to get flipped over to the side. It would take a ton of energy. It would take basically a diver going down there and flipping it over on purpose for that to happen. But it's probably not something that's going to happen with just ordinary conditions. Frankly, anything with enough force to flip that all the way over would probably also break off those parts of the shell, and the shell's just not built to deal with that kind of stress. Yeah. So at some point, even our bones fail. Yeah. Ride a motorcycle into a wall, our bones, good as they are, will probably fail. Yeah. That's just how it is. And so preventing overturning would work fine on a dynamic environment, would be okay on a static environment, but it wouldn't really have much of a purpose. Yeah. Does this shape facilitate writing? Like, is it a sort of a Weebles wobble where it will automatically sort of flip itself over, where it's not stable on one side and is super stable on the other? Unfortunately, in this one, the answer is no, because look at it. It's stable on this side, and it's stable if it's on this side. The animal very much wants to be on this side, like if you're looking at it from above, with its soft parts down the bottom, not flipped over and exposed to the world. But yeah, this particular shape would not necessarily help it much in that. And if this thing gets flipped, it may not do well. It may not survive. The odds would be against it. Yeah. Does this prevent sinking? Well, you can look over here and say, this one, it would eliminate a little bit of sinking. So it would act sort of like a snowshoe. We're distributing the weight of the shell, which is considerable. These are pretty thick, over a wider area so that if it's very soft substrate, they won't sink in. Because, gravity still applies underwater, and all that. It's just that the water and the buoyancy make things a little different. Now look at this. Instead of having a bunch of, or rather just a few very big, sort of thick, robust spines coming off, this thing has tons of very delicate spines. And so you could say that, this is actually probably much better prevention from sinking on a very soft substrate. And so you might conclude that this would probably be a better adaptation for sort of deep water, an area where there wouldn't be a lot of energy, because if you have enough energy for overturning or for needing to write or something like that, then it's probably going to break off all these little parts of the shell. And so that is definitely not going to be good for the animal. It's not going to be well adapted for that. But these guys are pretty robust, as are all the things you see in the intertidal zone, where the waves are constantly slapping at these guys. And they develop big, thick, tough shells that are heavy. They have various strategies to avoid getting flipped over. Anyway, that's a little intro to functional morphology. Now let's go through some more. And we'll do plants and animals, and just have a look at this. We'll do a little more of this in class, I think. Pitcher plants, fantastic. They have a variety of adaptations which are going to help them to collect their prey. So pitcher plants are carnivorous plants. They're going to survive by trapping insects, and there's going to be liquid down at the bottom of this, and that's also going to have some digestive juices in there. And the plant is either going to let the organism rot or is actively going to dissolve it once it falls into that pit. So it's just a question of how do you get ants to go into the little cup here. And so there are some that actually have secretions around the edge that are delicious for ants. And so if you're attracting them right to the edge, then maybe a few fall over. That's a reasonable strategy. There's some that develop a great big lip on the edge, which would look like a lovely place to sit if you're a fly, something like that. But it's also really slick. See how shiny that is? And so it looks like a good spot, but actually it's not a great spot. And it's not every time, but occasionally down they go. Here's another one. So this one just has little hairs on it, and it has been modified. So compare that to the last one. And here you can see this one went all in on sort of decoration around the edge of the cup, those particular modified leaves. And this one we have a very small little platform here. Mostly we're modifying the hood, and the hood is covered in these little like little bristles. But notice how all the little bristles point down. That means that if you have an insect, they're not going to be great for standing on because they're all sort of tapering this way, and so they might be a little bit slippery. And if an insect or something does go in there, then imagine trying to crawl up, but against these bristles. Now, whereas they help the insect to slide in, they're going to presumably trap the insect in there, or at least, do something. And these are all completely passive feeding strategies. The plant is not moving, the plant is not doing anything. It is just, it has evolved a particular shape that will passively bring food to it as long as there are insects in the world, and there are plenty, at least for the moment. All right, and so you'll have other versions of carnivorous plants that have a lot of other modifications. This sort of dazzle coloring may attract certain kinds of insects. You got sundews here, which actually develop a little bit of a sticky substance out there, and they will trap insects in that sticky substance. They'll actually sort of curl around them a little bit, and then they just start digesting. It's really slow, but once an insect is stuck, it is pretty hard for it to get out again. All right, functional morphology has been an interesting topic in paleontology for sure, because you usually only have parts of the organism. And we would like to know more about them, because that's the whole point of paleontology, understanding the world that came before and basically how we got where we are. Here's Parasaurolophus. Yeah, one of the best dinosaurs. Just look at that great big sort of horn on top of its head. And so, at least originally, there were a lot of ideas about what this could be. So you had some people who actually thought this is probably for vocalizations, and it does actually connect up. So you could blow air into it. And what it would do, people have made sort of plastic versions, 3D printed versions. This guy did a version out of a PVC pipe where he made this sort of chamber. And it produces a sound. It's a kind of a neat sound. We'll listen to it in class. There are other people who have thought that, one guy thought that there would be reactive chemicals in different chambers up here, which would be cool, but you'd have to ask yourself, all right, where are the enzymes that produce these reactive, maybe petrochemicals? Yeah, how do they come together? How would that evolve? What other intermediates do we see? Are there evidence of scorch marks? Because the idea was that they would exhale fire to be literal fire-breathing dragons. Probably not. Yeah. But, hypotheses are a way to get people thinking, at least at the start. So they're not necessarily bad. It's just that some of them have a whole lot less support than others, ultimately. Take plesiosaurs, for example, which when people were finding the bones, they were looking at these things and saying, wow, those are really weird. Why does it have that much neck, that little leg? Yeah, what is going on here? They're trying to imagine these things from the bones. And so here's your head up here. Here's your body down here. And as you can see, it's a fairly simple modification of a fairly normal body plan. They have, these are just the neck vertebrae, and they've been sort of stretched out, really elongated. And so there aren't necessarily more of them, or not many more of them than usual. It's just that each one is really long compared to, for example, the tail vertebrae, which you can see over here, which are, about an eighth of the size, a tenth of the size. So yeah, that's how it has a long neck. It's a modification of vertebrae, which are extending that neck. Now, people were trying to come up with, could this be for courting rituals, like mating displays? Like that looks pretty awesome. But then of course they figured out, oh yeah, these things are in the water, and in the water stuff that wouldn't make sense on land can make sense. Our little mascot today, this little clam that's digging and burying itself. Yeah, it just doesn't look amazing, but it's got the right tools for the job. Yeah, it's going to bury itself, and then once the tide comes back in, it's going to filter feed. All right. If you look at brachiopods or a whole bunch of bivalves, what you will see is this sort of zigzag along the commissure, which is the point where it opens, the anterior of the animal. And so it's like, all right, zigzags, those are neat, and you've certainly seen them in a lot of brachiopods, but why are they there? Or rather, if you have evolved this shell, what does that let you do? And then if you're successful, there's a chance that your offspring down the line will elaborate on this thing. You'll get some of them that are doing whatever you were doing even more so, and so it'll end up a little more extreme. And the answer we think is that it's going to trap particles. Because if you have just a straight opening, when you open up, and if these are filter feeders, they're going to pull in water. And it's not always just water. It is sometimes going to be water and sand, because that's where they live. Just the hazards of the job. And so if you have two shells that were to just open like this, let's say, then there would literally be no way to stop sand from coming in. So there would have to be some other strategy if they're living in a place where ingesting sand is bad. And I don't know if you've ever eaten sand, but it's not good. It's certainly not good. So right from the start, just the fact that the valves are going to open like this is going to create a little point where if a particle is coming in, it's actually, there's some point where it's going to get stuck if it happens to lodge on the shell where they come together. But with a zigzag, look at this. It can basically stay open, but it's got a range of different locations, which actually end up having sort of different particle sizes that they can trap. And so you can trap a whole bunch of particles, and basically it's like breathing through a little grill that's going to keep things out. It's like the air filter on your car that lets air in but traps all that dirt from the dusty road, so it does not go into your engine, because your engine doesn't run better breathing dirt, and nobody does. Yeah. So now you can look at these brachiopods again, and you can look at them in a new light and say, all right, what, based on if they have evolved this thing, and if we're looking at an extreme version where the moderate version was pretty successful, and so the extreme version ended up being more successful, what is it that they were doing? So there'll be some organisms that where you just have a pedicle, you have no other visible signs of attachment, and these may well have lived sort of epifaunally, just barely touching the ground and kind of swaying back and forth in the current. There are a lot of modern brachiopods that essentially do this. There are others where there may have been a long pedicle there, and you'd have a nice wide pedicle opening, perhaps, for a big muscular pedicle. And they could use that like a tongue for sort of burrowing in. Like if you were to burrow into a plate of peas for some reason, you could use your tongue to do that. You got some of these others like productids where they're going to have massive spines here. And those spines, as we saw in the brachiopod functional morphology, are going to act to hold the organism down to the substrate, basically. They're going to catch sand so that even if the substrate is moving, they're still going to retain enough of it around them so they're on an island of stability, essentially. And they'll be oriented at the correct orientation for maximum passive water flow, because who wants to work hard for a living? And so on. Take some of these other extreme ones. You'll have some that just grow spines at the front, like my beloved canetid brachiopods. And these are probably an anti-flipping measure. They're just increasing their surface area. They're saying it's like when you're crawling across thin ice, you spread yourself out. When you're putting snowshoes on, you're spreading out your weight, and you're just making yourself harder to flip, essentially. And there are others, there are some brachiopods that actually end up looking just like little corals. I think this one is meant to be a coral, but there are also brachiopods that have a little shell on the top, and they are coral mimics. Yeah. All right. So, for that infaunal lifestyle, living inside the dirt, it helps to be able to adjust because if you're living in a high energy environment, the level of the dirt is going to change. And if, as an organism, you have to literally grow to try and keep up with that, well, then what happens if, you get a weird current in there for a week and sort of washes some of the sand out? Now you're exposed, and there's no good way to shrink. Animals have not really figured that out. So it helps to be adaptable. It helps to be adjustable. And the pedicle is a really good sort of adjusting tool for these lingulid brachiopods. It's just going to reach down and it will dig. And it will dig down when they need to be down, and it will push up when they need to be up. It's just a nice controllable muscle. And so it can pull down to if the tide were to go out and stick itself back up or adjust when the tide comes in. And here are modern lingulids. So here it is in the process of burrowing. And here it is all the way burrowed in. It's perfectly set. This is looking from the side. This is looking from the top. And you can see the water inflow and outflow pipes there. All right. There are some brachiopods, mollusks, whatever, that are going to have a semi-infaunal paleoecology, most likely. And you can tell this, like if you just were to roll these things out on the counter, and don't do that to my brachiopods. I mean, come on. You would notice, and you can just look at these and say, I would notice that these would tend to land a particular side up, which is with this big flat side down here. And if it lands on either of these other sides, it's going to be unstable. It's going to rock with each wave until it gets flipped basically onto its interarea with its pedicle down. And it turns out that is an ideal position for these in terms of passive filter feeding. You'll get the most current in for the least amount of energy, which is what everybody wants. Yeah. More food for less, right? Yeah. You're college kids. Yeah. Some of those will be reclining, and they'll have little spines to hold them in, or a little boat shape where they'll probably bury themselves halfway. In order to do that, you got epifaunal brachiopods. These are going to live next to and kind of on top of, with their little pedicles sticking down, but they're not really going anywhere, and they're not going to be buried. So let's talk bivalves, because mostly this is going to be about mollusks, and remind you again of our beautiful bivalve mascot up here at the top. So these are oysters. These are potentially the same oyster, I think. So looking at these things, what can you tell about the mode of life of these things? And so this is something we'll talk about in class, and so we won't really cover it here, but yeah, there's a little explanation down at the bottom. So, all right. Consider Pectenidae, scallops. There are different kinds, and you can spot the ones that live basically attached to the bottom, and you can spot the ones that are free-living swimmers, because the free swimmers are about as symmetrical as you can be. They grow these little ears, and they're of equal length. They are not quite perfectly symmetrical. That's kind of not in their body plan, but they get darn close, and they are close enough that it allows them to swim over short distances. And this is a body plan that would frankly be rubbish if you were trying to swim over long distances. This entire presentation, by the way, is from a very good Chinese paleontologist who's much better at functional morphology than I am. All right. So here's how they would work. The long one wing being very wide is going to prevent flipping. Presumably that could be done with two wings, but if you can achieve the same effect using less calcite and less energy, then that is going to be the path of least resistance. That's what evolution is going to pick. The free swimmer is going to tend to have fairly even wings. Just the same thing as like canoeing or rowboat. You want equal number of oars on either side for maximum going forward, maximum swimming effectiveness. But bivalves have many different modes of life. I think that's a better way to say it. From the completely infaunal to the epifaunal to varieties that are like this. A lot of these are going to be filter feeders, and so they're showing the water coming in and the water going out here. And a lot of them are going to have modified shells with structures on those. Quite often, when you see these modified shells, what you'll see is that if they are living in or on a substrate, they will have a lot of ridges, a lot of texture, which is going to grab the substrate. Yeah, that's not a thing that's usually thought to be particularly good in free swimming bivalves, for example. If they are burrowers, where they have to burrow themselves down a lot, you may see very little texture on the outside only because that makes it a little easier to burrow. Or you may see shells that have variable texture, where they're going to be very smooth on one side, which is, I think, usually the side that is down, and very rough on the parts that are up near the surface, because that's where it actually will do you some good to hold on to the substrate. The rest is going to be buried anyway, unless, some sea otter digs them up or something like that. I don't even know if they do that. So yeah, here are some examples. You have some that are unattached and are recumbent, so they're going to potentially rock with the tide, or the dirt may build up around them. You got some that are swimmers that are going to be nice and symmetrical. You got some that are borers that may evolve less of a shell, basically, or a highly modified, in this case it's a cylindrical shell, because they have to essentially carve out a hollow in which to live. Some of these things will burrow into a wood, like on docks, or they used to do it on ships. And you'll have others that are, more adapted for burrowing, and will have the appropriate sorts of ornamentation. Okay, within the mollusks, there's a group that are called rudists. And these are, I believe, extinct now, but they were big during the Mesozoic, particularly in the Cretaceous. These things formed reefs, and they would grow, and they would grow up sort of together. And so they would each be trying to sort of out-escalate the others and get a little higher, because if you're higher up, and you're filter feeding, you get first access to the stuff. It's like trees in a canopy in a jungle. If you're high and broad, then you can potentially get all the sunlight before the little plants down below even get a chance at it. Yeah, biology is never fair. Never, ever. So look at some of these. We'll do this in class. What might these things be doing? How might they work? And why? Yeah. All right. Consider Calceola sandalina. This is the little coral with the operculum, and we have one in the collection. Here's the operculum. It's a little bit off to the side, but it's easier to see that way. Ours is snugly on. This is just showing that they are reconstructed as having a recumbent mode of life, where the lid would essentially be able to be opened to allow feeding. And they're not going to filter feed, presumably. They're going to catch prey and sort of pounce on anything that wanders into the tentacles, stun it, and digest it. And then if this was living in an area where sediment sort of rolling down or being moved on was a problem, like from the current here, then the lid can just go closed and would then protect the animal from getting bombarded by, dirt. So a coral that evolved something like an operculum would be able to survive in environments with a lot more flying debris, flying sand, basically, which would probably be very detrimental to other kinds of corals that did not have this level of protection. It's armoring. It would allow these to survive in some areas and colonize those areas where there might be food, but there might also be danger. Yeah. Okay. And let's talk serpulid worms. These are some, and they actually start out straight, but as they grow, they're going to make this sort of curved shape, just like this. And the idea there is they're growing, the body is growing, they're able to digest more when they're bigger, for example. And the function of this, growing on a curve, is that they're going to become progressively more and more difficult to get out of the ground as time goes on. There's no real benefit for these particular serpulids in being above the bottom surface, essentially, because they're just going to be picking small particles out of the water column above them. And the more you stick out, the more exposed you are to predators. Yeah. Although, of course, we could imagine other modes of existence for some of these. Like you could imagine them, how would they work? Would they work well just sort of being flipped over? Is this like a modification to avoid being flipped, or is this a modification that allows you to be infaunal? And then that's where paleontologists come in, and you can actually, if you discover these in situ, you can figure out which way the layers are being deposited, so you can tell the orientation of the sea bottom, and then you can see what is the orientation of my fossil relative to the sea bottom. Yeah, actually excavating things in place when you can find them is very valuable, very useful in paleontology. All right, and so these are some more little mollusks. And yeah, a lot of these things will actually tilt as they grow. These are just mostly oysters. And some of these are actually going to live on soft bottoms. And so this is an adaptation, like this sort of tilting growth will allow an organism to constantly keep ahead potentially of changes in the environment. So they're going to grow slowly, but they're going to grow in such a way that they're always kind of tilting up away from where the dirt is going to be coming in. And hopefully that keeps them from being buried and still having access to food. Yeah, so there are a lot of morphological adaptations that we can see, for example, in brachiopods to avoid sinking into soft substrates. So it's thought that those spines would also have that function, particularly the more delicate spines that would be broken off in a high energy environment. In some brachiopods, they're going to modify the inter area, which is like the posterior, and they'll get a great big wide space between these valves, just like that. You'll see it on some of these crazy spirifers. And that is an adaptation that is going to basically snowshoe them. It's going to make them very broad so that they will sit on the floor. You get others that are very sort of long and wide, and these can more or less hide and blend into the bottom and be very difficult to flip over. Yeah, something like that. You'll also see the same thing in corals. I don't know if you noticed the corals that we have looked at. A lot of those end up being curved, and we think it's the same sort of thing. We think these are on a hillside, and they are maybe semi-infaunal or possibly epifaunal, but maybe semi-infaunal and living on a slope. And so, yeah, as they're growing, they are basically hugging the ground, but still maintaining a sort of an upright oral opening so that they can still eat food. Yeah, and they're oriented correctly to do that. Because if you're just laying here sort of parallel to the bottom, then some of these tentacles are going to be buried in mud all the time, and that's, you can't feed. Yeah, if your tentacles are buried in mud. Yeah. All right, so what do we do then when we have really early organisms, late Ediacaran organisms, for example? How do we figure out what their morphology is trying to tell us about their functional morphology of these relatively early animals? So here are some. These are some of these tube-like organisms. Conotubus is one of these. Yeah, there's Conotubus. And they're going to grow. It's going to be like a little cone shape, and it's going to grow another little cone shape inside of it that comes out. And so it's just like it's like a stack of cups, just like red plastic cups stack up. Is how this organism is. And there's a little bottom to each of these cups, so it's just sort of growing a new living space. There doesn't appear to be any of the organism that is left behind in the earlier sections that we can detect. So here you can see kind of the way that they're put together, this sort of cup-in-cup architecture. They have an embryonic cone-shaped part, and so they will have a first stage of development where they're just a cone, and it turns into a long cone, and it curves a little bit. So right now we're thinking semi-infaunal, right? At least partly infaunal. And then they'll start building these little cups, and each cup can take on a slightly different orientation. And so these may be adjusting to changes in a sort of tilting sea bottom, for example. Yeah, and so here are some of the organisms. And so here you can see where the little joins between the different stages are, and they'll sometimes actually break at those stages. And there you can see, so they're very wiggly shaped. Look at that; it's kind of shaped like an M on its side, or like a little lightning bolt. And so it's certainly a challenge to figure out what exactly was going on here, but a semi-infaunal lifestyle, I think, makes a lot of sense for Conotubus. Yeah. And so here's how they're reconstructed. As they are young, they will just grow sort of taller. And if they are not perturbed, if they're in sort of a hard environment, they can just grow upward. And upward means you have access to food that's coming in from higher if they're filter feeding. We have no idea what the soft parts of these animals look like. So it's completely speculative trying to assign these to even affinity to any known animal group. Yeah, they look animal, they seem animal in that they are not plant, but beyond that, it's pretty tough. But you'll notice that in other places they will actually grow, and it will basically take the same form as those serpulids. So that's why some people are thinking, oh, this is more like a serpulid worm. Yeah, and it could be. All right. Did you have a look at those bivalves earlier? Look at these. Yeah. So with some bivalves, you'll have different structures that will give them basically traction. So these are going to be buried at least halfway, and they're pretty smooth down here for ease of digging, because these are not very good digging animals necessarily. They're not super well adapted to that, although the bivalve up here is trying very hard and is succeeding. Yeah. Yeah. But then you look, and the texture really starts here. They get an amazing sort of crisscross texture there, and that would presumably have the effect of holding them into the ground. So it's like you plant a spike, and then it's like the little barbs on the back of an arrowhead. Like the point drives it in, and then the little barbs sort of prevent it from coming out. That's the idea. Okay, and so we're looking at some more of these. Saying they're basically snowshoeing. If you have a tubular body plan, you're making yourself very long, and so you're not going to sink in to the very, very soft substrate, but you can continue. And so we think that there's kind of a range of dorsal valve convexity. There's a range of ventral valve convexity, and if they're both very convex, then you're going to get what's probably basically a sphere. And so that's going to be most likely free-lying or epifaunal if it's attached by its little pedicle. If you get ones where one side is completely flat and the other side is cupped like a boat, probably you're looking at something that is going to be semi-infaunal, halfway buried but able to open its lid to access food. If you're looking at something that is just flat all over, then there's a range of possibilities there. But if you have a massive inter area, then the idea is that that's like a snowshoe, and that's going to support you so you don't sink into the mud and orient you correctly. You see this in little tiny things. These are foraminifera, which can form, you'll see them most commonly in fossils when they're stuck to something else that helps them get preserved, but they don't necessarily have to be stuck to something in order to get preserved. But you will see them coiling up to basically avoid being sucked down into the mud, because as they build their shells, they get heavier and heavier. You'll see tube worms of different kinds. Serpulorbis are these guys, and so they're growing together. They've got a nice stable base, but look how all the tubes are pointing away from each other. This is going to be an adaptation. It's like I'm going to grow in my own direction. And so each of these is going to be able to feed because they're pointed away. So they're sort of scouring more space. If they lived in an area where all the food came from a particular direction, then there would probably only be one solution and they would end up looking more like this. Yeah. And so there are bivalves that are going to burrow very deeply. These are going to be ones that live in the intertidal zone, for example, because they're going to have to get down far enough to where there is still some water. Because for mollusks, land snails are an exception. But they're pretty modified so that they can do this. But most of their respiration is going to be based on pumping water over gills. And so you need water for that to happen. They're not great at holding their breath necessarily, at least not for multiple hours. You see functional morphology adaptations in ostracods. Now these are seed shrimp. They have two little valves and little, shrimpy parts in the middle. Imagine something like a little water flea, although they're a different kind of thing. And what you'll see is that when we have increasing mechanical energy and increasing thermal energy, so in hotter environments, they will actually develop different patterns on there. And so the shape of ostracods can be an indicator as to paleoclimate and to the energy on a particular exposure. This is a term, I don't know if you've had much marine biology, but this is a thing that can be measured at the beach. Organisms that live in higher energy environments will have adaptations that help them to basically stay stuck down when there's a lot of high energy waves, swirling around, a lot of water moving them. But yeah, so you'll get some of these that have like a very fine, they call it a box frame pattern, like little crisscrosses, just like that, little hashtags. But in a high energy environment, these little delicate features will be broken off immediately. So what you get are bigger, coarser features that are thicker and fewer, but they're still doing the same thing. They're still serving the same function. They're sort of catching water and controlling water that is nearby. You'll get some that have a real keel there, which is going to potentially help them to swim. You get some that have sort of a corrugation on there, and you'll get the sort of delicate, dainty version versus the very big, thick version up there. You'll get some that appear to have just sort of holes and little dents all over the place, like on a golf ball, which are going to help control the water as these things swim. And swim or burrow. Yeah, some of these things are burrowers for sure. You'll see that those just sort of flatten out and just are sacrificed in order to make a bigger, thicker, more robust shell in high energy environments. Yeah. So, in ostracods, like those, depending on their type of locomotion. For the modern ones, we can say, all right, we can observe these. We can say, these are crawling. And so you can say, all right, if it's a crawler, it's on a soft substrate, what you tend to see is that they will often have keels for support as they're crawling along. So they're basically snowshoeing. Yeah. If they're in a coarse substrate where they're going to sort of burrow between fairly large grains, then you'll see ribbing to strengthen the valve because they would not do well otherwise. If you see burrowers that go into soft substrates, those tend to be very smooth, very long. It's just like slide the knife in to the ground sort of morphology. And burrowers that are in coarser environments where they're kind of pushing between the grains, they'll tend to have very small, short, robust, nice, thick valves. So, yeah, have a look at this. Think about it. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, just intuitively. The swimmer is going to have very smooth, lightweight valves because the valve is potentially more of a hindrance for a swimmer than a help, because it's not going to keep you from being battered by little grains necessarily. It could slow you down and limit movement. Yeah. What if you looked at crinoid arms and how they branch? So you can imagine you have everything from a simple one. So if that's our ancestral condition, which you do find on the early ones, the ambulacral groove will run up here, which is just a little sort of highway with paired tube feet that are going to grab food and pass it along and then move it down toward the mouth. So it's just a little food conveyor belt. If you put on little side branches that have their own little mini conveyor belts, then those are basically expanding your feeding area to pull it in. If you have tons of those, look at that, then that dramatically expands the feeding area. So these are now filter feeding like champs, or snagging particles out of the water, I guess might be a better way to say it. And remember, it's not a case of an animal needs to eat more so it develops more of these. It's like if it happens to mutate and has more little pinnules on the side, is there an advantage for that in some situation? Is there some case in which natural selection would actually favor this mutant? Yeah. And yeah, sometimes there are. You'll see just modifications D and E are increasing the essential feeding surface area that you saw increase from A to B already. And so the higher it is, the greater area it can filter. The wider it can open, the greater area it can sort of clear out. This sort of fan filtration area. So you can calculate this for crinoids, and this will tell you how they fit in, like how closely together they can probably pack. Because if one is clearing out all of this space around itself, then you probably won't have these very close to each other. You would have them sort of spread out, just because they probably couldn't get enough nutrients to survive if they were any closer than this. And it's not that the animal necessarily thought about it for a while and then was like, yeah, I'm going to go over here. It's that the babies are broadcast out into the world, and they land where they land, and some of them make it and some of them don't. And the ones that make it are far enough away from the next one that they have their own filter feeding space. Yeah. Big concept in ecology is niche partitioning. So within an area, let's say within a little lagoon, you will find organisms that adjust themselves to be feeding at different heights off the substrate. So shown here, you have a bunch of organisms that are basically in and on the substrate. And if you're burrowing down and looking for rotting food, that can work. That's a legitimate lifestyle. Then look at these. You'll have different filter feeders. And some of these are actually very tall. These are all for crinoids. And so this is a way you can end up with lots of different crinoids in the same environment. Like in this particular environment, if there was some mutation, some kind of genetic change or epigenetic change that allowed a crinoid to fit right here at this sort of 75, whatever that is, centimeter mark maybe, then probably there's an open ecological niche there, because they would be taller than everything of this little species down here, shorter than everything of this species, but in water you don't necessarily get everything coming from top to bottom. They're going to be currents that go side to side. So yeah, potentially a 75 centimeter would have a chance to be there. Okay. And that's the end of functional morphology. So a lot to think about, a lot to look for on fossils, and just see if you can figure out what it is that this fossil is trying to show you. What is it trying to do? Or what would it be good at by virtue of the shape that it is? Yeah, because that's the first step to understanding how the ecology of a paleontological ecosystem worked. All right. Thanks very much.